This is a 190 Q&A practice test. Plaintiff attorney, Mr. Landon, capital L-A-N-D-O-N. Defense attorney, Mr. Perez, capital P-E-R-E-Z. And we'll start with defense attorney. Ready? Here we go. Zippers, pulls, anything like that? No. All right, thank you very much, sir. Any redirect? Yes, Judge, thank you. Couple of points, Mr. Davis. First of all, I would like to ask you about this question relative to the transportation of the SUV. Counsel asked you if you could have remained and helped with other searches instead of going with the vehicle to Detroit. What is the protocol? What is the recommended procedure for the crime lab analyst when there are two of you there with a critical piece of evidence like the SUV? Well, I was asked if we could get the vehicle back to the lab and asked to see if I could expedite getting work done on it prior to Monday morning. Who asked you to do that? It was either Investigator Sanchez or Special Agent Ross. All right, now in terms of transportation of a key piece of evidence like that, is there a concern on the part of the analyst that the evidence be transported safely? Well, definitely. I wanted it enclosed. It is now in my custody. We could have turned it over to Cross County and they could have taken custody and dealt with getting to the lab. But you took control of the SUV, right? Yes, all right, and to ensure that it was safely transported to the crime lab without incident, took two of you to do it, right? Yes, all right, now counsel asked you a couple of hypotheticals about the presence of a certain Ford key and the possibility of DNA on that key. Well, Mr. Davis, we have person number one, who's the owner of the key, person number two, who does not own the key, but at some point obtains possession of the key, and during the course of obtaining possession of the key, actively bleeds on the key, wipes the blood off the key. It's not entirely unexpected that you would find the DNA profile of the person who possessed the key and who wiped the blood off the key. That's not an unusual finding, would it not? Well, in that situation, you would have two activities promoting finding the second person rather than the first person. If you bleed on the key, now you are supplying a large quantity of your own DNA, and even if the other person's DNA is there, you may mask them because now you have actual bodily fluids rather than stray skin cells. So there's more DNA in blood than I would expect to find from something that had been touched. So you could cover over the DNA, and if you then wiped it off, now you are physically removing possibly all the DNA that's present, the first person and the second person. And if the second person, not the original owner of the key, had possession of that key for 4 days, one would expect that you are most likely going to find the profile of the person who last possessed the key. Isn't that true? As you explained it, I would expect, yes, to find the second person's, and it would not be unusual at all to find no other DNA profile on that key, would it? No, that would be not unusual. In fact, the likelihood of that occurring is enhanced by the fact that person number two actually had possession of the key for, say, 4 days at a minimum. The longer the time, you would expect more contact, more possibility for DNA being deposited. Now let's talk a little bit about this contamination issue. The fact that certain bits of evidence can become contaminated is not all that unusual, is it? The fact that it can happen, yes, it is not unusual and it is expected, and we take precautions to prevent that. And as a matter of fact, contamination can occur, as counsel said, during the collection of the evidence, during the transport of the evidence, and during the analysis of the evidence. As I understood your answer, is that right? Yes. All right, well, it's also possible that contamination of a crime scene could occur before law enforcement even arrives, yes. And as a matter of fact, in your experience, it's not unusual at all for perpetrators of crimes to take efforts to alter crime scenes, is it? That's quite common to see attempts being made to clean up. All right, and what types of efforts have you seen certain suspects undertake to clean up, as you say, a crime scene? Objection. Now we're getting too far afield of this case. I disagree heartily. Counsel went down this road. We're entitled to respond. I'll give you a little latitude. continue. I have seen cases where it was a shooting in a carpeted area. We saw some of the blood spatter pattern we talked about before up on the ceiling on some of the furniture, and there was absolutely no apparent blood on the carpeting, so we saw a fine, hard to see mist of blood, and you would expect to see then something on the carpeting if someone had been shot there. There was a rug doctor sitting next to it. This area, they had rented the rug doctor and shampooed the carpet. When we ripped up the carpet, a large blood pool on the floor under the carpeting had soaked into the padding. So they had obviously attempted to clean the blood pool from the shooting. And is it possible to clean up blood with certain agents such as bleach? Yes, bleach is very effective. We use bleach in the lab to clean our work areas. It actually destroys DNA, destroys the blood. It decontaminates it. It's very useful for that. All right, now another thing about this contamination issue, just so we're clear, does contamination transform one person's DNA profile into that of another? It cannot change a DNA profile. It can hide a DNA profile though. So what you would have then is a mixture. You could have a mixture, or you could fail to see the first person if the second person deposited a much greater quantity of DNA. But it's still interpretable, is it not? Yeah, you could see DNA types and you would be able to interpret them. So I take it it's still possible then to have reliable findings notwithstanding that type of contamination. It's possible. Now returning again to the question counsel asked about actively bleeding. If a suspect was actively bleeding and entered a vehicle, you would expect to find an impact blood stain, would you not? That would not be uncommon. If they were actively bleeding and blood was dripping from them, then an impact stain would be the blood falling off of the person and gravity pulling it to the floor and hitting. That would be the impact. All right, and what is a contact stain? That's where I'm bleeding, have blood on an item, and the item touches another item, and now I leave some blood on the second item. And you would expect to find that as well if a person was actively bleeding and had been in a particular vehicle that is now undergoing an examination. If they had touched something with a bloodied hand or whatever, then you would expect some transfer of blood. Even if it was just a cut on the finger, sure. Is it possible? Well, before I go there, are you familiar with a phrase called a transfer stain? Well, there's a transfer of blood from one item to another. So by contact, you are thinking that contact and transfer is one in the same concept. Yes, and I am not a blood spatter pattern expert. I have been to some training. I am able to recognize it when I see it, but I don't interpret it. So I don't know all the specific jargon about swipes and wipes and contacts and transfers, high impact, immediate impact, and low impact cast off. I'm familiar with the terms, but I couldn't tell you that that's a transfer, not a contact, or a swipe, not a wipe. Well, returning again to our example of the person 1 and person number 2, and person 1 being the owner of the key and person 2 being the last one to possess the key. Well, if person number 2 had been actively bleeding, entered a vehicle holding the ignition key in their right hand, and then attempted to start the vehicle, it would not be unusual at all to find a contact stain near the ignition in that vehicle. Objection to the characterization of not unusual. There's no factual distinction as to how that would occur. I will sustain the objection based on the form of the question. All right, the word list. We have Davis, capital D-A-V-I-S. Detroit, capital D-E-T-R-O-I-T. Sanchez, capital S-A-N-C-H-E-Z. Ross, capital R-O-S-S. Cross, capital C-R-O-S-S. Ford, capital F-O-R-D. Rug Doctor, capital R-U-G. New word, capital D-O-C-T-O-R. And that is it for the word list. And that will conclude our 190 Q&A practice test.